Welcome, everyone, for this week's edition of the Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where we continue on the fourth movement of our symposium on statecraft. Last week, we were introduced to the 20th century with an evaluation of Shikanta Diop and the lesser-known aspect of the Pan-African movement, and also the suppression and revival of a lot of history of Africa, which imperialists have worked very hard to basically collectively destroy. So that was a fun class, and it should be up on our YouTube channel soon. This week, we have the pleasure of listening to Cynthia, who has done an incredible amount of research on different aspects of Cold War history. And today, she will enlighten us over some of the drama, some of the fights, some of the potentials, and some of the tragedies that unfolded in the 1940s, 50s, even into the 60s, with a focus on the conference at Bandung and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which has a lot of implications on the current world order, much more than many people realize. So without further ado, Cynthia, it is all yours.
All right. So this class is going to be on the Bandung conference. I titled it The Voice of the People. And I'll explain that statement if I'm sure a lot of people are not familiar with this story. Actually, a lot of Westerners are entirely aware of the Bandung conference and its significance. And I think that this is not only reveals a great shortcoming in Western understanding, not even into what we could call Eastern dynamics, but really world dynamics. But it exemplifies the crisis that we are presently in terms of a lack of historical and cultural understanding. And this is a very careless way of conducting international relations, which has only resulted in further division and confrontation, and will eventually lead to war if we don't check ourselves. So it's not a coincidence that we find ourselves in this situation today. However, there's one thing that is very different for today's situation, which is that for the first time in history, Asian, African, and South American countries are becoming increasingly aligned with each other in defiance to the Western diktat. And for the first time in history, they have leading countries that are powerful enough politically, economically, and militarily to competently oppose the Western diktat. This is actually not a threat to the West, as it's erroneously being spun in mainstream media. The West today, in fact, has an opportunity to change its course on the sea of history. The West has an opportunity today, as it did in 1955 with the Bandung Conference, to recognize the right of sovereignty and the right for a people of a nation to choose their own destiny. I think there are many people who would agree that this simple phrasing would agree with the simple phrasing, but the problem arises in where do we find the trust to allow such countries to develop into powerful and independent nations after pretty much everything the West has done to them? And how can we be sure that they in turn will not try to subdue the West, to colonize the West, or even destroy it? This is a rather sad thought because it is based in fear and ignorance, and the solution is love and wisdom. If we do not have access to love and wisdom, we will be blind to it when we are confronted with it. And that is what the geopolitics of the West has largely become. It is navigating blind on the seas of history and is bound to hit something that it happens to find in its way. The solution is rather simple. The antidote to fear and ignorance is understanding. And with understanding, one can begin their journey towards accessing love and wisdom. It is of utmost importance that people today understand what truly orchestrated the Cold War that continues to this day, and the sickening level of bloodshed that had to occur in order for that Cold War narrative to take hold. We must know the truth about how many millions of people were butchered only a few years after World War II in order for Western dominance to continue in Asia, rather than what was naturally sprouting as independence movements inspired by the American Revolution against the British Empire. So the Bandung Conference occurred 10 years after the official end of World War II in April 1955. World War II, a war that was supposedly fought against fascism. It was understood by most of the countries in Asia and Africa who had been colonies primarily of the British, French, Dutch, Belgium, and Portuguese, that this liberation from fascism would include a liberation from imperialism. Matt, there are people waiting in the room. That the World Proclamation to take arms against fascism, costing tens of millions of lives, was based in the recognition to the right of human dignity and liberty, and thus in turn imperialism would also have no place in the framework of a post-World War II world. This was indeed the intention upheld by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. However, with his passing away in April 1945, such a trajectory was on very unstable ground. The Bandung Conference was the first large-scale Asian-African conference in history. Its 5 organizers were Indonesia, India, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, Burma, which is now Myanmar, and Pakistan, all fresh out of British or Dutch colonialism. The conference took place over 6 days and was held in Bandung, West Java, Indonesia. 29 countries participated and represented at the time a total population of 1.5 billion people, 54% of the world's population. These countries now represent about 75% of the world's population. The conference was organized with Sukarno of Indonesia, Utu of Burma, Nehru from India, and so forth. But China, represented by Zhou Enlai, and Nasser, representing Egypt, and Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana were also very instrumental players in this. Mossadegh would have most certainly also played a very important part in this, but there was an MI6 CIA coup in Iran just 2 years before. The conference's stated aims were to promote Afro-Asian economic and cultural cooperation and to oppose colonialism or neocolonialism by any nation. The conference was an important step towards the eventual creation of the non-aligned movement, which was an effort to avoid the polarized world of the Cold War between communist and capitalist states. Drawing on the principles agreed at the Bandung Conference in 1955, the non-aligned movement was established in 1961 in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, through an initiative of Indian Prime Minister Nehru, Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah, Indonesian President Sukarno, Egyptian President Nasser, and Yugoslavian President Josip Broz Tito. So, all of these countries were represented at the Bandung Conference, even though Sun Yat-sen had already passed away by then. But I'm going to say a little bit of something about each one of these individuals. And even though Mossadegh wasn't at this Bandung Conference, he represented the spirit. Sun Yat-sen, for those who are not aware, was the first president of the Republic of China and is considered one of the founding fathers of the People's Republic of China. Sun Yat-sen's led the Chinese Revolution to free itself from the corruption of the Qing dynasty, and he refused to accept certain Chinese customs and rituals that could not be justified without reason. He was a follower of Confucius, but he had also converted to Christianity after his stay in Hawaii, where he was organizing with American patriots, and where he became a follower of the School of Economics upheld by Abraham Lincoln and Henry C. Carey. Sun Yat-sen is considered one of the greatest leaders in modern day Asia and is pretty much universally respected there. This is extremely important because, as I will discuss further shortly, Sun Yat-sen intended to incorporate the American system of economics to the development of China. On September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The first lines of his speech repeated verbatim the famous second paragraph of America's 1776 Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. He was a strong ally to Roosevelt and was the only communist leader besides the Chinese communists who refused to be neutral against the Japanese fascists during Stalin's neutrality agreement with Hitler, which lasted till Operation Barbarossa when Germany invaded the Soviet Union June 1941. Ho Chi Minh was very well educated. He was a poet and was fluent in several languages, including English. We'll talk a little bit more about most of these people. Sukarno is the president of Indonesia. He's one of the leaders of the Bandung Conference, and we will hear a lot about him, so I won't say too much about him right now. President Nasser of Egypt was successful in nationalizing Egypt's Suez Canal and ending the British occupation of Egypt, whose British military had been there for over 75 years. Nasser also worked hard for the right of Egypt and other nations to industrialize. He also worked to unite the Arab world. Nasser understood that the Middle East, which had been carved up under the Sykes-Picot Accord, was done in such a conscious way to separate developing urban centers from the resources of the oil fields. And he was trying to correct that. Instead, regions like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, which existed as a result of the Sykes-Picot, were encouraged to remain backwards in tribalism and antagonistic to development, such as the large urban centers in Egypt. That's all I'll say for now. President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana was a leader of the Pan-African movement, and he worked closely with Kennedy in the creation of the Volta Dam in Ghana. Mossadegh, again, who wasn't personally attending the conference because he was under house arrest at that point, also played a major role for the nationalization of Iran's oil. He actually went about this in the most legal way possible. He argued the case at the court, the Hague court, that the British consortium needed to end. And he won his case. He actually had a PhD in law from Switzerland. And so the British answered this by orchestrating an MI6 CIA coup in 1953. So just to make a note that all of these people were very pro-American in terms of the American system under Lincoln and Henry C. Carey. They recognized that the American Revolution was one of the most important examples of resistance to colonial rule, and they used this as an example, a model for their own countries. We can see this very clearly with Sun Yat-sen's 3 Principles of the People, which was obviously influenced by Lincoln. And here are stamps also showcasing the closeness between their two understandings of how to approach economics. Sun Yat-sen would say, does someone want to read the quote actually?
Everyone, I'll do it.
Oh, there
okay. Shall I go ahead?
Yep.
Okay. To work out the salvation of China is exclusively the duty of our own. But as the problem has recently found a worldwide interest, we, in order to make sure of our success, must appeal to the people of the United States in particular for your sympathy and support, either moral or material, because you are the pioneers of Western civilization in Japan. Because you are a Christian nation, because we intend to model our government after yours. Above all, because you are the champion of liberty and democracy. We hope we may find many Lafayettes among you.
Yeah, so there's so much in Sun Yat-sen's writings that are, I think, very important for Westerners to read, to get an understanding of someone who greatly influenced and continues to influence how Asia approaches its ideas in economic development. Sun Yat-sen would also say in his first lecture on nationalism, our 3 principles of the people mean government, of the people, by the people, and for the people. That is, A state belonging to all the people, a government controlled by all the people, and rights and benefits for the enjoyment of all the people. If this is true, the people will have a share in everything. When the people share everything in the state, then will we truly reach the goal of the Minsheng principle, which is Confucius's hope of a great commonwealth. And again, Sun Yat-sen was a Christian and a Confucian follower. He didn't see any contradiction in that. And if you want to know more about why that is the case, you can refer to Michael Bellington's excellent paper titled Toward the Ecumenical Unity of East and West, the Renaissance of Confucian China and Christian Europe, which goes through in wonderful detail how that is the case. Sun Yat-sen would also say in his 1919 treatise, the world has been greatly benefited by the development of America as an industrial and a commercial nation. So a developed China, with her 400 millions of population, will be another new world in the economic sense. The nations which will take part in this development will reap immense advantages. Furthermore, international cooperation of this kind cannot but help strengthen the brotherhood of man. The Atlantic Charter would be signed by Roosevelt and a very reluctant Churchill in 1941, making clear the intention, with Roosevelt quite literally at the helm, since they signed this on a ship, where, quote, to respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and to see sovereign rights and self-government restored, to choose the form of government under which they will live, and to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. I think I might have botched that quote a little bit, but that's the essence of that. So you can see that there was a very natural union that was forming as World War II was approaching. Upon FDR's death in April 1945, British foreign policy under Churchill managed to reverse Roosevelt's decolonization process. Not only were former colonies recolonized, even before World War II was officially over, but Asian colonies that had been occupied by the Japanese were also considered fair game. However, many nationalists, Asian nationalists in the colonial nations developed a clear understanding of the difference between the two opposing ideas within the Western Allied leaderships. Rather than seeing only a monolithic control structure in the West, they recognized in FDR a different type of leader, with an American system outlook that was for industrialization of all nations and based on the founding principles of the Republic that, quote, all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, end quote. Roosevelt's idea for the former colonies following the defeat of the Japanese was for territorial trusteeship, whereby an international institution such as that proposed, as the proposed United Nations, which I'll talk a little bit more later, would oversee a transition to independence and self-determination over a specified time frame, such as had already been established by the United States in the Philippines during the 1930s. He insisted that colonization must end and that Hong Kong in particular must be returned to China. There is no shortage of Churchill on record going apoplectic over Roosevelt's firm stance in the decolonization of all nations upon winning World War II. Churchill would have to succumb to Roosevelt as long as he remained president of the United States. Britain was in no situation to challenge the US foreign policy at the time, understanding that they were dangerously isolated from the world during that time, and the tyranny of the British Empire was still fresh in everyone's minds. The question was, what would the United States become without Roosevelt at the helm? My God, they make this so hard to see. So although much damage from Western imperialism would already occur by the time of the Bandung Conference, which was held in 1955, this was still primarily due to British, French, and Dutch attempt to recolonize their former territories. There was still a pro-American sentiment, despite this, that continued amongst pretty much all of the leading figures of the Bandung Conference. The United States was still seen during this time as predominantly opposed to imperialism, and the recent granting of independence of the Philippines, July 1946, which was an American colony that was ceded over by Spain after the 1898 war, gave great hope that the Americans would support the Bandung spirit. The United States was... Right. This was observed rather strikingly in Sukarno's speech that opened the Bandung Conference. Sukarno had to fight hard for Indonesian independence after World War II, when the British and then the Dutch colonialists had re-entered Indonesia. This was the case for many countries. They announced a proclamation of independence. They were under the they were led to believe that this was going to be granted to them, and they were all compromised in one way or another, either through clandestine operations or a direct occupation occurred, such that these proclamation of independences were rendered moot. So Sukarno was a leading revolutionary figure against the Dutch colonialists since the 1920s in Indonesia. And he finally succeeded in freeing Indonesia in 1949. So that was 4 years after their proclamation of independence. This freeing of Indonesia from the Dutch rule was after 149 approximately rule by the Dutch under the Dutch East Indies. So they won their independence December 49. Yep, sorry. My notes are a little bit all over the place for this class, sorry. So one of the things that Sukarno said, which is really striking in his opening speech, it opened the Bandung Conference. So it really was what set the standard for the spirit of what everybody was standing up for. Does someone want to read actually the excerpt from President Sukarno?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Today is a famous anniversary in that battle against colonialism. On the 18th of April, 1775, just 180 years ago, Paul Revere rode at midnight through the New England countryside, warning of the approach of the British troops and of the opening of the American War of Independence, the first successful anti-colonialist war in history. About this midnight ride, the poet Longfellow wrote, "A cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. Yes, it shall echo forevermore. That battle, which began 180 years ago, is not yet completely won. Colonialism has also its modern dress in the form of economic control, intellectual control, actual physical control by a small but alien community within a nation. It behooves us to take particular care to ensure that the principle, which is usually called the live and let live principle, mark. I do not say the principle of laissez-faire, laissez-passer, of liberalism, which is obsolete, is first of all applied by us, most completely within our own Asian and African frontiers." Excerpt of President Sukarno's opening speech at the Bandung Conference.
Mm-hmm. So the Bandung Conference was held April 18th to April 24th, 1955, which April 18th, as he's making very clear in his speech, was the first day marking the American Revolution. And that was certainly not a coincidence. So they were sending a very strong message to the United States that they were in common spirit to that. Sukarno would also quote Roosevelt later on in the speech saying, "We are living in a world of fear, perhaps this fear is a greater danger than danger itself. Not only is this a clear support of the spirit of the American Revolution, which was certainly not, what the Cold War doctrine was trying to label these countries after World War II, but it also clearly labels the British imperial system, this laissez-faire, laissez-passer, free trade system, which was used to justify the Opium Wars on China. So they're very aware of who their friend and who their enemy is in the future view for mankind. Right, so the question is, if there was such a pro-American sentiment at the end of World War II, what went wrong? And why were each one of these leading figures in the previous slide I showed you, why were many of these men labeled as instigators against the peace after World War II? And to answer this question, we're going to go through a little bit of forgotten, or rather buried, chapters in history. So in 1943 at the Quebec Conference, Churchill established a British Southeast Asia Command, acronym SEAC, headquartered in Kandy, British Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, with Admiral Louis Mountbatten in command. What this did was it divided the Southeast Asia theater between General MacArthur's Pacific Command and Mountbatten's SEAC. The British got Burma, Myanmar, and Malaya, which is now Malaysia, their previous colonies, as well as Thailand, Singapore, and Sumatra. But they were not satisfied and continued to pressure the United States to allow British priority in continuing to liberate the entire region after World War II and after the convenient Iron Curtain speech. The US intention in agreeing to the SEAC, because Roosevelt was still alive for another 2 years approximately, was that the British would take a larger role in defeating the Japanese in Burma, thus opening up a southern route for the resupply to China. So if you see on the map, Myanmar, the location of Myanmar would have been very important in helping send supplies to China during World War II. And help them in defeating the Japanese fascists, resources that were greatly needed. However, Mountbatten would sabotage this, and to the point actually where General Stilwell, commander of the US forces of China, Burma, India, would declare the Limeys, which is American slang for a British person around the mid-19th century, a derogatory term. The Limeys have now shown their hand. This pusillanimous and double-crossing program amply confirms our suspicions. They are determined to keep China blocked and powerless. So recall that Roosevelt was of the vision for the four great powers after World War II, which were going to act as temporary stewards, you could say, during this trusteeship period where countries would meet certain conditions, but in a responsible manner, being overseen by the four great powers, which would be the US, Britain, Russia, and China. So it was very important that China continue to be a unified country. And under Roosevelt, that was the intention. However, the British wanted to balkanize the Chinese. So there was a lot of infighting between these two visions. Many Americans joked that SEAC actually stood for Save England's Asian Colonies. General Weidemeyer, which was the United States Army commander who served in Asia during World War II, would also agree to this. In October 1943, to the end of the war, recognized one of the major reasons why the CCP and the Kuomintang were unable to form an alliance against the Japanese was due to British sabotage and instigation. The British were playing the same old imperial game of flaring up the bad blood that had already developed between the two groups, the age-old game of divide and conquer. The CCP did recognize this would ultimately lead to the balkanization of China if the union of China against the Japanese imperialists was not put forward as the #1 priority before all else. Weidemauer would say, "We Americans interpret US policy as requiring a strong, unified China and a China fighting effectively against Japanese. There is considerable evidence that British policy is not in consonance with US policy. British ambassador personally suggested to me that a strong unified China would be dangerous to the world and certainly would jeopardize the white man's position immediately in Far East and ultimately throughout the world." And the British War Department would they wouldn't shy away from this. They didn't really deny this. In a memo, February 1944, they wrote, "Our main reason for favoring the restoration of Indochina to France is that we see danger to our own Far Eastern colonies. In President Roosevelt's ideas that restoration depends upon the United Nations, or rather the US, satisfying themselves that the French record in Indochina justifies the restoration of French authority." What he's basically saying is that even if you wanted to argue your colonial rights, you would have to showcase that the area that you were responsible for was actually advancing, which obviously was not a way that the colonialists were thinking. In the London Daily Mail, they made their case even more clear, what the actual target of British foreign policy was. They write, "Anti-British psychology has not been discouraged by our American ally. US propagandists have been working from Lanchao Gateway to Tibet to the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. A great plan to dam the Yangtze, known as the Yangtze Valley Authority, will be one of the greatest engineering contracts of modern times. Their geologists have plotted the old caravan trails to the fringes of Tibet and the wild Western tribal countries." Thus, the British were identifying the threat over 50 years ago of China establishing itself as a truly independent nation state through such great development projects as the Yangtze Dam, now completed as the Three Gorges Dam, and the reconstruction of the old Silk Road, now the center of China's development policy under the name of the Eurasian Land Bridge. And as today, there's much pressure for the US to not collaborate with China on such great projects. And as today, Britain and the US regard the Belt and Road as a threat to Western hegemony. In fact, they have gone so far as to say that it is a threat to national security. Projects like the Mekong River Basin Survey, modeled after the Tennessee Valley Authority, were set back for decades. Some were never even built to this day, such as the Kra Canal or the Thai Canal, which would connect the Gulf of Thailand with the Andaman Sea across the Kra Isthmus in southern Thailand. It is envisaged that such a canal would improve transportation in the region, similar to the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal, and thus greatly increase the standard of living and development in these surrounding areas. This exposes the true intention of the Cold War doctrine, which continues to this day, that the threat was never really considered to be communism as such, but rather the cause of nationalism, to which the communists more often than not supported, since under nationalism, industrialization is considered fundamental to the liberation of the people. It is the liberation of a people and the creation of sovereign nation states which is considered the real enemy to a system of imperialism, which is the reality of the Western framework today. Roosevelt stood his ground against this British foreign policy at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, forcing the British agreement to the trusteeship principle. Historian William Roger Louis declared, "The British post-war colonial vision died at Yalta." The specifics of the trusteeship policy were left to the founding conference of the United Nations, which would be held in San Francisco, April 25, 1945. Roosevelt, in preparation for that conference, developed a plan to send international teams of technicians, doctors, economists, and others to thoroughly investigate the conditions and needs in the colonies such that the trusteeship would lead directly to independence. He had no intention of leaving the development of the former colonial world to free trade of Adam Smith's invisible hand, which he knew to be neither free nor invisible, but a direct tool of colonial oppression, as seen most transparently with the two opium wars against China. Unfortunately, Roosevelt died April 12, 1945, just 2 weeks before the founding conference of the United Nations. Even more unfortunately, a leading delegate to that conference was John Foster Dulles, a traitor to his country and one of Roosevelt's most outspoken political enemies. In 1943, Dulles published a book called The Six Pillars of Peace, calling for a world government to be called the United Nations. Dulles would say at the conference that trusteeship really only meant autonomy for the colonies within the European empires. Such autonomy would equate to national leaders ruling over a colonial entity, that this would be the new concept for nationalism, away from the Westphalian principle of sovereign nation states who would have a right to govern their own political, economic, and cultural development. Instead, these leaders would have to answer to a head conglomerate for permission. The Cold War doctrine was thus used as an excuse for why the majority of the world could not be allowed to govern themselves and would have to be treated like children and answer to a government board that would be responsible for the policies of the entire world. John Foster Dulles would move on to be essentially the controller of US foreign policy under Eisenhower, and despite some resistance from Eisenhower, the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles being the head of the CIA for over a decade, were in favor of British policy and essentially always got their way after the death of Roosevelt until the Kennedy presidency. This included, most notably, the disastrous Vietnam War. Also at the founding conference of the United Nations was Harold Stassen, who would say, there were some areas which could never govern themselves and hence could not, for their own welfare, be allowed to determine their own political status. We do not wish to find ourselves committed to breaking up the British Empire. Quite a clear statement of how American policy changed on a dime 2 weeks after Roosevelt's death. What this meant was that any Asian or African nation that insisted that it be responsible for its own development and governance would be labeled a threat to Western democracy, or really the British Empire, the security of the British Empire from now on, and that with Roosevelt's death, the new United States was sending a clear message that they would fully back this British foreign policy for recolonization. Also at the founding United Nations conference was Lord Cranbourne, 5th Marquess of Salisbury, which is a very, very distinguished title in Britain, who, very happy with this, said, the genuine conviction of the US delegation that the unity and strength of colonial empires, not only the British, is essential to world security and is a very healthy development in US opinion. With Roosevelt's death, the British were able to convince President Truman to transfer post-war responsibility for all of Southeast Asia to the British SEAC under Mountbatten. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Truman removed all of the Netherlands, East Indies, and most of French Indochina from the command of General MacArthur. Hong Kong was handed back to the British, and Burma was removed from the command of the US and placed entirely under Mountbatten's SEAC. Though the United States would not directly recolonize the Philippines under Truman, they would have a heavy military presence within the country, with several large bases, military bases, until the mid-1990s. The Philippines would actually be involved in CIA training for clandestine operations, to which their skills were heavily used during the Vietnam War. For more on this, I would refer to Colonel Prouty's book, The CIA, Vietnam, and the Plot to Assassinate John F. Kennedy, which goes through this in detail. Colonel Prouty was the head of the special operations at one point. The rest of the Southeast Asia would remain largely under British control, except for the northern half of Vietnam. Immediately after the Japanese surrender, the British moved to occupy Burma, Singapore, Malaya, and Hong Kong, their former colonies, as well as Indonesia, Thailand, and South Vietnam. While Truman acted like the US would not contribute any material to back up such maneuvers, the reality was that American ships and planes were transporting European colonial armies back to their former possessions. On August 17, 1945, President Sukarno, leader of the movement for national independence of the Dutch East Indies since the 1920s, issued a proclamation of independence for the United States of Indonesia. The Dutch refused to recognize the Indonesian government, and Sukarno was declared a Japanese collaborator. Freed in 1942 from his 8-year house arrest under Dutch colonial rule, during the 3-year Japanese occupation, Sukarno organized the Indonesian people into a united force, a nation, based on principles distilled from his study of the history of both Western and Eastern civilizations. If someone wants to read the quote, this is an excerpt from one of Mike Billington's papers.
I can do it. Sukarno published an article entitled Nationalism, Islam, and Marxism in the journal Young Indonesia in 1926, which was to characterize his entire life's dedication to a unity of principle between these three apparently disparate paths of political and social organization. He was critical of the Marxist rejection of religion, but he distinguished between historical materialism and philosophical materialism, defending the former against the latter. And he insisted that Marxism need not be anti-religious. The common goal of nationhood and a dedication to universal principles provided the basis for unity.
So, as we'll see, hopefully in this lecture, is that there's a real oversimplification of what is the intention of these countries in pursuing independence. And the oversimplification of just being a follower of Soviet communism was very inaccurate, as you can even see in Mike Billington's explanation of this, which is that in the case of China and Indonesia, they had incorporated their own cultural views along with the ideas of communism. And in the case of Sukarno, he wasn't, as you know, it's been shown, he recognizes the American system of economics as well. It was not necessarily his belief system, but it was necessary for the unity of a country that you have a diversity of ideas, that ideas are not meant to be just squashed violently, but that if everybody is for the welfare of the country and for the union, the peaceful union of the country and its peaceful relations with other countries, there should be no problem in having a diverse government that shares many different views, but that the common moral ground is always a priority. And we'll see with the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the Bandung Conference, that is really the moral of the lesson, is that if you put the welfare of others at the forefront, ideas should have a lot more freedom to grow, to be discussed, to be cultivated, rather than be beholden to either the Western framework, which was highly imperialist, or the very literal translation of the Soviet translation of communism, or interpretation of communism. To also give us an idea of how challenging Sukarno's situation was Indonesia was made up of almost over 17,000 islands, 6,000 of which were inhabited. It consisted of 5 major islands and 30 smaller islands, which was made up of multi-ethnic, linguistic, and religious groupings. Sukarno understood that such a geographic makeup would make a solid union difficult. However, he understood that it was the only way, that only through a strong national core could they protect themselves against others deciding the fate of the people for them. And so Sukarno, in March 1945, the Japanese occupation government, aware that they were about to lose the war, they established a committee for independence in Indonesia and implemented similar measures in other South Asian nations. On June 1st, 1945, Sukarno spoke to the committee and presented his concept called Pancasila, 5 principles, which were to become the constitutional principles of the Republic of Indonesia and still are to this day. Someone can read them.
Okay. Sukarno's Pancasila: nationalism, one national state, one Indonesian soil, from the tip of Sumatra to the tip of Iria. 2, internationalism, but not cosmopolitanism, which does not recognize nationalism. Internationalism cannot flower if it is not rooted in the soil of nationalism. 3, representative government, the principle of consent, of consultations. 4, social justice. In the field of economy too, we must create equality and the best common prosperity. 5, belief in God. Free Indonesia with faith in God, the Almighty, with full freedom for all religions.
Yes, so Sukarno was not only a great admirer of Lincoln, but that of Sun Yat-sen, which made sense because Sun Yat-sen was a great admirer of Lincoln. And Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles of the people were highly influential for Sukarno's Pancasila. Sukarno would compress these 5 principles into 3 principles, uniting nationalism and internationalism as a single principle. He also combined representative government with social justice, since a democracy without justice is not democracy at all. Sukarno then said that these 3 principles could in turn be combined into one principle, which he called mutual cooperation. Sukarno's Pancasila had a tremendous influence over the region of Southeast Asia in the coming decades in its struggle against colonialism. In October 1945, only 4 months after Sukarno's announcement of Pancasila, the British requested entry into Indonesia on the false pretense that they were there only to oversee the release of European prisoners that had been held by the Japanese. Within 2 weeks of the prisoners' release, the British broke the agreement and launched a war against Sukarno's nationalist forces. The British were, of course, not using British soldiers, but rather Mountbatten had deployed an army made up almost entirely of Indians. The next month, the Dutch arrived on US ships and were even more brutal than the British in enforcing the recolonization of the Indonesian people. This sparked an outcry in the US, and Truman finally ordered an end to all US participation in Mountbatten's SEAC. However, he would do nothing to stand in its way. Mountbatten would also play a role in Burma, pretending to be in favor of Burmese independence in 1946. Aung San, the nationalist leader of Burma, was assassinated soon before the scheduled date of independence, the only leader who could have conceivably united the country at the time. After his assassination, Burma fell into, very predictably, a civil war immediately following independence. The Hill Country became a staging ground for British and US covert operations for the next 50 years and was a primary source of opium production. Mountbatten then proceeded to oversee the British-mandated partition of India into India and Pakistan assuring instability and bloody communal warfare for many years to come. Mountbatten tried to portray himself as a friend to nationalism and democracy and a vocal critic of the Dutch and French's heavy-handed treatment of nationalist forces in their colonies, conveniently turning a blind eye to Britain's heavy-handedness in Hong Kong, Palestine, and India. The reason for the facade was because Mountbatten was simply following orders. There would be a new gloss, so to speak, over the age-old foreign policy of the British Empire. Mike Billington writes, Mountbatten's crucial role for the empire was in recognizing that the existing form of 19th century European colonialism could not survive in a world forever changed by the US role in World War II, and the threat of a US-led world economic order based on technologically driven collaboration among sovereign nation states. To preserve the reality of the British Empire in a new form required granting independence, but only after fostering multiple points of division. The weak China policy was applied universally. So in the end, Churchill would have his way. The British, and to a lesser extent the French and the Dutch, at reconquest of their former colonies, made promises of good intentions to eventually decolonize. However, once they established their power militarily, they reneged on their promises. The justification being that these colonies were too weak to defend themselves against the spread of Russian-dictated communism. People such as Sukarno, overnight, went from being criticized as an abider to Japanese fascism to now being a communist sympathizer. And thus much of Asia and Africa found themselves in a similarly debased fashion. They were not allowed to be individuals, to be free to create their own fate from something new. They were not free to have their own ideas, their own schools of thought. Instead, they were treated as children with no choice but to choose the ideology of one parent or the other. However, this was largely Western hypocrisy, as was so clearly seen by the very domineering presence of Western imperialism and increasingly clandestine warfare. The reason why so many nationalist leaders were open to working with the communists within their country was because the communists were also for nationalism against imperialism, and nothing came remotely close to the level of destruction that was occurring on a military and economic level from Western imperialism, which curbed technological progress in favor of backwardness. To side with Western imperialism would mean you would be a traitor to your own people. It was equivalent to agreeing to perpetual tyranny through poverty and enslavement. This is why so many countries continued a strong pro-American sentiment, even after the disaster of the Korean War, because they recognized a choice between Western imperialism and Soviet communism was an artificial construct, that there existed a very clear third option, that of the American system of economics, which was opposed to systems of imperialism. However, as we will continue to see, this pro-American system, pro-Roosevelt sentiment was largely ignored from the West. With Roosevelt's death, the Cold War doctrine was free to argue that such nations seeking independence and self-governance were acting recklessly, and ultimately, due to their refusal to abide by Western diktat, were considered aggressive to Western democracy and values. Thus, any country who resisted the Western diktat, which was the foreign policy of the British Empire, was assumed a collaborator of Soviet communism. There was no acceptable neutral ground, since it was considered impossible that any nation could resist being influenced by one side or the other. Oh, I don't have the full quote from, this is a quote from Michael Billington's article. So hold on, give me a second. I'll just read it out loud. In 1958, British intelligence consolidated its control over the direction of strategic policy on both sides of the Cold War divide through the creation of the Pugwash conferences. Pugwash was set up by networks run by Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells as an alliance of scientists and political representatives from both the USSR and the West, committed to the British utopian policy of world government. The keynote speech at the founding conference in Pugwash, Nova Scotia was given by the US-based physicist Leo Szilard. Szilard had become a protege of H.G. Wells while a student at Oxford, and his Pugwash speech presented Wells's version of nuclear terror as a basis for establishing world government. The policy became known as mutually assured destruction, otherwise known as MAD. This is from Michael Billington's article, When America Let Britain Run and Ruin US-Asia Policy. This calculation of, you're on one side or the other, this calculation of measured risk was never investigated, it was never verified. It was a veneer of pseudoscience. It was simply implied, and it was justified through these Pugwash conferences for the with the intention of justifying the need for a world government, which essentially is one empire with colonies. This one world government was in favor of the other choice of sovereign nation states. The reality of the situation was that this estimation of risk was completely off the mark. The reality of the situation was that most of these countries were fighting for independence, were verifiably nationalists with a pro-American sentiment until their countries were decimated by these very foreign powers, such as was the case with Vietnam. I might talk a little bit more about that, but I'll see with how I'm doing with time. So I'll just move on for now. However, there was a competent resistance to this tyranny. The most important factor in the process leading up to the 1955 Bandung Conference of Asian and African nations was the fact that in several cases, the colonial powers were simply defeated militarily despite their vastly superior technology. Sukarno used the term moral violence to explain this, that just as with an individual, a nation has the right to defend itself from an outside aggressor. The Republic of Indonesia's victory against the Dutch colonialists in 1949 showed that nationalist military forces with Republican leadership could defeat a European occupation army. Indonesia's victory gave hope to colonial nations throughout the world. And in 1953, it was clear to all but the blind that the French in Vietnam were soon to face the same fate as the Dutch in Indonesia. The result was the Geneva Conference, which was held in 1954. Despite John Foster Dulles' effort to isolate the Chinese at the Geneva Conference, including his ostentatious refusal to accept Zhou Enlai's outstretched hand, Zhou nonetheless established contacts with the US delegation to the conference. As a result, the US and China set up a process for regular formal, if unofficial, meetings in Geneva beginning in August 1955 and lasting into the Kennedy administration. Zhou Enlai's personal leadership within China was crucial in the move toward establishing normal relations with the West. With the Korean armistice in 1953, Zhou Enlai's approach advocating peaceful coexistence with China's neighbors and the Western powers rose in influence within China, such that by 1956, Zhou was premier foreign minister and the second-ranking member of China's hierarchy after Mao Zedong. In April 1954, just before the Geneva Conference on Vietnam, Zhou initiated bilateral agreements with India, with Prime Minister Nehru, and with Burma, President UNU, which established the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. This initiative by Zhou, Nehru, and UNU would become a central concept motivating the spirit of Bandung. The 5 principles of coexistence, otherwise known as Panchil, was a new set of principles for the conduct of international relations that would reflect the aspirations of all nations to coexist and prosper together in peace and harmony. He was a peaceful offering as an alternative to the warmongering of the Cold War doctrine. The Sino-Indian Treaty of 1954 stated in its preamble that the two governments, being desirous of promoting trade and cultural intercourse between the Tibet region of China and India, and of facilitating pilgrimage and travel by the peoples of China and India, based their agreement on the 5 principles of coexistence, which is really an initiative by Zhou Enlai. The 5 principles being, number 1, mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. 2, mutual non-aggression. Number 3, mutual non-interference. Number 4, equality and mutual benefit. And number 5, peaceful coexistence. 2 months later, during the visit of Premier Zhou Enlai to India, he and Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru issued a joint statement on June 28, 1954, that elaborated their vision of Panchil as the framework, not only for relations between the two countries, but also for the relations with all countries, so that a solid foundation could be laid for peace and security in the world. Panchil, as envisioned by its creators, gave substance to the voice of newly established countries who were seeking the space to consolidate their hard-won independence, as it provided an alternative ideology dedicated to peace and development of all as the basis for international interaction, whether bilateral or multilateral. At that time, the two prime ministers also expressed the hope in the joint statement that the adoption of Panchil would, quote, also help in creating an area of peace which, as circumstances permit, can be enlarged, thus lessening the chances of war and strengthening the cause of peace all over the world, end quote. This vision caught the imagination of the peoples of Asia and the world. Panchil was incorporated into the 10 principles of international peace and cooperation enunciated in the declaration issued by the April 1955 Bandung Conference, which included 29 Afro-Asian countries. The universal relevance of Panchil was emphasized when its tenets were incorporated in a resolution on peaceful coexistence presented by India, Yugoslavia, and Sweden, and unanimously adopted on December 11, 1957 by the United Nations General Assembly. In 1961, the Conference of the Non-Aligned Nations in Belgrade accepted Panchil as the principal core of the non-aligned movement. To celebrate the 50th anniversary of Panchil, the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, released a beautiful 13-page pamphlet, which I've included some excerpts of, if someone would like to read this one.
I can read.
Mm-hmm.
The timeless relevance of Panchil is based on its firm roots in the cultural traditions of its originators, two of the world's most ancient civilizations. The linkage that was established by the spread of Buddhism in China laid the historical basis for the formulation of the principles of Panchil by India and China. On the 50th anniversary of Panchil, we can, without hesitation, say that its relevance, as embodied in the joint statement of 1954, shines as brightly today as when it was first conceived. Panchil was developed in the context of a post-colonial world where many were seeking an alternative ideology dedicated to peace and development of all. 50 years later, the world is now searching for an alternative to the adversarial constructs that dominated the Cold War era. Countries all over the world are focusing on creating extended and mutually supportive arrangements and attempting to define a new economic, social, and political world order in the context of globalization, non-traditional security threats, and the quest for multipolarization.
You can continue, Luke.
Today, Panchil can help the world move away from the traditional concepts of balance of power and competitive security, the consequent searching for an enemy and the predicating of activities on conflicts rather than cooperation. What should be stressed today is that the principles of Panchil are not just empowering principles, they are also guiding principles that enshrine a certain code of behavior. Their essence is the non-use of power, the approach of tolerance, of living one's life, learning from others, but neither interfering nor being interfered with, and the obligation to do unto others as you would do, or as you would have them do unto you. It may not be out of place in a world searching for moral certainties to emphasize this message of Panchil.
Thank you. So the original idea for the Bandung conference came from the Indonesian Prime Minister Ali Sastro Amid Jojo at a meeting of the Colombo Group comprising India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Indonesia, an alliance of formerly colonized nations. The proposed conference was to be the first time that the nations of the Third World would meet together without the Western powers present. Sukarno described it in his opening speech as, quote, the first international conference of colored peoples in the history of mankind, end quote. The unifying principles were anti-colonialism and the commitment to peace and development in nations which had won their independence. But the most crucial strategic issue in the minds of the conference initiators was the threat of a US-China war. The initial statement calling for the conference to be held in Bandung in April 1955 included a reference to, quote, the desire of the 5 sponsors to lay a firmer foundation for China's peaceful relations with the rest of the world, not only with the West, but equally with themselves and other areas of Southeast Asia peripheral to China, end quote. The 29 nations from Asia, the Arab world, and Black Africa who attended the conference had many serious differences, especially in regard to alliances with either the West or with the Soviet bloc, which threatened to disrupt their unity of purpose. These conflicts resulted in an extraordinary process of constructive dialogue and diplomacy, which Zhou Enlai, the head of China's delegation, exerted exceptional leadership. As part of President Sukarno's opening speech, he says, great chasms yawn between nations and groups of nations. Our unhappy world is torn and tortured, and the peoples of all countries walk in fear, lest, through no fault of their own, the dogs of war are unchained once again. The nations of Asia and Africa cannot, even if they wish to, avoid their part in finding solutions to these problems. We have heavy responsibilities to ourselves and to the world and to the yet unborn generations. The peoples of Asia and Africa wield little physical power. What can we do? We can do much. We can inject the voice of reason into world affairs. We can mobilize all the spiritual, all the moral, all the political strength of Asia and Africa on the side of peace. Yes, we the peoples of Asia and Africa, 1.4 billion strong, far more than half the human population of the world, we can mobilize what I have called the moral violence of nations in favor of peace. Again, moral violence means to defend your country against external aggression, not in the way that the West interprets it, but that if people are invading your country, you get to defend yourself, basically. He continues, quoting Roosevelt, we are living in a world of fear. Perhaps this fear is a greater danger than the danger itself. Bear in mind the words of one of Asia's greatest sons, Sun Yat-sen. To speak is easy, to act is hard, to understand is hardest. Once one understands, action is easy. The highest purpose of man is the liberation of man from his bonds of fear, his bonds of human degradation, his bonds of poverty. The liberation of man from the physical, spiritual, and intellectual bonds which have for too long stunted the development of humanity's majority. And let us remember, sisters and brothers, that for the sake of all that, we Asians and Africans must be united. So, I mean, really, really beautiful quote. So what happened to the spirit of Bandung? We will read an excerpt from Mike Billington's excellent paper, Britain's Cold War Against FDR's Grand Design, the East Asian Theater, 1943 to 1963, to get the answer. Does anyone want to read it?
Okay. In 1957, John Foster Dulles formed the ad hoc Interdepartmental Committee on Indonesia, composed of the State Department, the
CIA.
The CIA and the Department of Defense, which issued a special report in September. The report called for covert operations to exploit the not inconsiderable potential political resources and economic leverage available in the outer islands, particularly Sumatra and Sulawesi, and to strengthen the determination, will, and cohesion of the anti-communist forces in the outer islands, to provide a rallying point if the communists take over Java. Note that this supposedly US plan was a carbon copy of the 1946 proposal of Mountbatten's political advisor, Sir Esler Denning, referenced above, and to divide Indonesia along regional lines in order to facilitate Dutch recolonization. Although Eisenhower officially rejected the special report on Indonesia, subsequent developments followed the prescription to the letter. CIA Chief Allen Dulles gave the green light for covert military operations, dubbing it Operation Hike.
Sorry for the misspellings. I wrote a little bit quickly in preparing some of the slides. So as we're seeing, and again, like the Vietnam War is a very clear example of this. I wrote a paper on this, which I can include in a link below, heavily relying on Colonel Prouty's book, which I referenced earlier. But the reality of, for instance, the Vietnam situation was that North Vietnam was given to China to recognize the liberation of North Vietnam, which they recognized Ho Chi Minh, and everything was fine there. South Vietnam was under the responsibility of the British, and they had released French Vichy prisoners that had been put in prison by the Japanese fascists, and they had let them run loose in South Vietnam, which they, created a lot of problems. And this was used to justify the French colonial re-entry very quickly into back into Vietnam. And when Ho Chi Minh's forces beat the French, the Americans were then pressured that it was their moral obligation to intervene in Vietnam, which for years before the direct military intervention into Vietnam, they had clandestine operations, also using of the Filipinos who were trained by the CIA. So this sort of warfare increasingly started to happen, which was entirely hypocritical because, it was under the Cold War doctrine that these people were threats to Western security, Western democracy values, when in reality, it was always a fight for independence. But these clandestine operations, obviously, a lot of them, they get leaked after, years later. And the passions of the people in the West, they sway to and fro. And oftentimes, even if something is leaked years later, there's not an ability, it seems, to be able to put the picture as a whole. And for some reason, there is still a continued belief that even if the West was proved to be dishonest then, we should believe the narrative today, the ongoing narrative, the same narrative. It's never changed. And yet, no matter how much, gets leaked, there are people who continue to believe in it for some reason. I'm going to continue reading an excerpt from the same paper from Michael Billington. However, contrary to most popular accounts, the 1957 to 58 subversion of Indonesia was not initiated by the United States, but was already in full swing under British direction. Several regional military officials in Sumatra had established extensive smuggling operations with British Singapore. British intelligence utilized these contacts to activate the Old Denning Plan. The Anglo-American subversion was then unleashed in full force, only barely maintaining plausible deniability. In February 1958, a revolutionary government of the Republic of Indonesia was created. Currency for the new government was to be printed in London. A central plank of each faction for the rebellion was a ban on the PKI, the Communist Party of Indonesia. Then on May 18th, the CIA's plausible denial was blown to bits when a B-26 was shot down after bombing the port city of Ambon in the Moluccas. The American pilot was captured, complete with US Air Force identification, and passes to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. However, the spirit of Bandung, as far as the prospect for US participation in an anti-colonial alliance, was shattered. So I hope it's becoming clear, or I'm pretty much at the end of the lecture, so I hope it is clear for people that the American system under the Lincoln, Henry C. Carey, and Roosevelt initiatives was what was very much understood, arguably understood better than Asians by Asians during the 20th century than the Americans themselves, as to what it represented in terms of the struggle for liberty against imperialism. And what happened after Roosevelt's death was really a takeover of British foreign policy, such that American foreign policy adopted British foreign policy, which you can actually see very clearly with the NSC 75, which states clearly that the new American policy under Truman would be to protect the British Empire interests, because it was being argued that it was preferred that the British Empire's interests be defended over the Soviet danger, which, from what I have reviewed from history, was greatly inflated. So this is the tragedy, that the Bandung Conference made such a beautiful, peaceful offering to the United States, and they were largely deaf and blind to it. Today, a very similar situation is happening, and we should really take the time to reflect upon, how much do we really understand what the message is coming from these quarters of the world. JFK said on the Senate floor, July 2nd, 1957, very beautiful speech he made. He said, "The most powerful single force in the world today is neither communism nor capitalism, neither the H-bomb nor the guided missile. It is man's eternal desire to be free and independent. The great enemy of that tremendous force of freedom is called, for want of a more precise term, imperialism. And today that means Soviet imperialism, and whether we like it or not, and though they are not to be equated, Western imperialism. Thus, the single most important test of American foreign policy today is how we meet the challenge of imperialism, what we do to further man's desire to be free. On this test, more than on any other, this nation shall be critically judged by the uncommitted millions in Asia and Africa, and anxiously watched by the still hopeful lovers of freedom behind the Iron Curtain. If we fail to meet the challenge of either Soviet or Western imperialism, then no amount of foreign aid, no aggrandizement of armaments, no new pacts or doctrines or high-level conferences can prevent further setbacks to our course and to our security. Kennedy would be the only president to revive the American system policies since Roosevelt. He worked closely with Kwame Nkrumah in building the Volta River Project, otherwise known as the Akosombo Dam. When Kwame Nkrumah was given a copy of the Warren Commission report, which was the investigation on Kennedy's assassination, it is said that he took a look at the list of names responsible for the writing of the report and is recorded as saying, "Alan Dulles oversaw this report. That is enough said for me." Today, Asian and African countries contribute $25 trillion, 33% of world GDP. Well, this is actually 2015 statistics, so it's definitely much more than that now. The population of Asia and Africa is 3/4 of the world population, 75%. Xi Jinping made an address to the 19th National Congress of the CPC saying, these are two quotes. One of them is with him on September 22nd, 2020. He says, "Cold War thinking, ideological lines, or zero-sum game are no solution to a country's own problems, still less an answer to mankind's common challenges. What we need to do is to replace conflict with dialogue, coercion with consultation, and zero-sum with win-win." And then at the 19th National Congress, he said, "China will continue to hold high the banner of peace, development, cooperation, and mutual benefit, and uphold its fundamental foreign policy goal of preserving world peace and promoting common development. China remains firm in its commitment to strengthening friendship and cooperation with other countries on the basis of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and to forging a new form of international relations featuring mutual respect, fairness, justice, and win-win cooperation." This is another quote. "China is ready to jointly promote the Belt and Road Initiative with international partners. We hope to create new drivers to power common development through this new platform of international cooperation, and we hope to turn it into a road of peace, prosperity, and openness, green development and innovation, and a road that brings together different civilizations." This is actually a picture of the Croc Canal, which is part of the plan with the Belt and Road Initiative. The Croc Canal has still yet to be built, which would greatly benefit trade in this area. Last quote from President Xi. Does someone want to read it? Oh, actually, no, that's not the last quote.
I vote for Kwan. Or anyone is okay too.
Okay, I'll do it. For a civilization to endure, efforts must be made to keep it alive and build on its heritage from one generation to the next. More importantly, a civilization needs to adapt itself to the changing times and break new ground. The history of world civilizations tells us that every civilization needs to advance with the times and take in the best of its age in order to develop itself. We need to come up with new ideas to add impetus and inspiration to the development of our civilizations. With these efforts, we will deliver achievements for our civilizations to transcend time and space and have a lasting appeal. To spur people's innovation and creativity, the best way is to come into contact with different civilizations, see the strengths of others, and draw upon them.
You can continue to read, Magdalena.
Okay. Difference in itself is no cause for alarm. What does bring alarm is arrogance, prejudice, and hatred. It is the attempt to impose hierarchy on human civilization, or to force one's own history, culture, and social system upon others. The right choice is for countries to pursue peaceful coexistence based on mutual respect and only finding common ground while shelving differences, and to promote exchanges and mutual learning. This is the way to add impetus to the progress of human civilization.
And with that, I'll end with Sun Yat-sen's quote, "To speak is easy, to act is hard, to understand is hardest. Once one understands, action is easy." I'll end it there, and we'll open up for questions, which I'm sure there's probably going to be some.